So far, you have seen many of the built-in functions in MySQL. You have seen the aggregate functions like min, max, and so on. You have also seen the functions for working with numbers, dates, strings, and so on. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create your own functions. Functions are very similar to stored procedures, but the main difference is that a function can only return a single value. So unlike stored procedures, they cannot return result sets with multiple rows and columns. So in situations where you want to return a single value, you can create a function. A good example of this is the calculation of risk factor that we did in the last lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to create a function for calculating the risk factor per client. So let's close the stored procedures folder, right-click on functions, and create a new function. The syntax for creating functions is very similar to the syntax for creating stored procedures. So here we have create function. We give it a name like get risk factor for client. Here in parentheses, we define our parameters like client ID of type integer. Next, we have this return statement. This is one of the main differences between functions and stored procedures. And this specifies the type of value that this function returns. So we can have int or integer or any other data types that we have in MySQL. Now, right after the return statement, we need to set the attributes of a function. Every MySQL function should have at least one attribute. These are the attributes. One is deterministic, which means if we give this function the same set of values, it always returns the same value. This is useful in situations where you're not going to return a value based on the data in your database because the data can change. A real-world use case is a function that calculates the shipping or tax for an order. You might have a formula based on your business rules. Let's say the tax should be 10% of the order's total. So the function receives the order total and returns the tax amount. It's deterministic, which means it always returns the same output for the same inputs. So here's one attribute. Another attribute is reads SQL data. And this means that you're going to have a select statement in your function to read some data. We also have modifies SQL data, and that means you're going to have an insert, update, or delete statement in your function. Now, you can have multiple attributes here. For example, if your function both reads and modifies data, you can have both these attributes here. Now, back to our example. In this example, our function is not going to be deterministic because if we give it the same client ID, it may return different values. 1 second later, the client may pay some of their invoices, so the risk factor can change in a second. So we remove this attribute. We're going to read data using a select statement. So I'm going to keep this attribute, but we're not going to modify anything. So I'm going to delete this attribute. Next, we have the begin statement. Here we write our select statements. And finally, we should always return a value. So to save time, I'm going to copy some code from our get risk factor procedure that we created in the last lecture. So let's go back there. We're going to bring all these variables. We're going to bring our select statement as well as the formula for calculating the risk factor. So copy back to the new function. Let's paste them here. Now we need to change the select statement and add a where clause here. So where, here we should give this table an alias like I, where I.clientID equal to the client ID parameter of this function. Next, we calculate the risk factor. And finally, using the return statement, we return it. So risk factor. That's how we create functions. Let's go ahead and click on apply. All right, now let's apply the changes. Beautiful. Now we have a new function. We can use this function in our select statements, just like the built-in functions in MySQL. So we can select the client ID and name columns from the client's table. This returns these two columns here. Beautiful. Now we can add a third column, and here we can call our new function, get risk factor for client. And as the argument, we pass the client ID. There you go. Now we can see the risk factor for all these clients. Some of them don't have a risk factor. We see null here because these clients don't have any invoices. So back to our function, where we calculate risk factor, we get the invoices total, which is the count of everything. This is always 0 or greater. Now, the second value here is invoices count, which is the sum of invoice total column. Now, if this client doesn't have any invoices, sum is going to return null. So 0 divided by null produces null. Here we can use the if null function. So if risk factor is null, we can return 0. Okay, let's apply the changes. Beautiful. Now, back to our query. Let's execute this one more time. Now, instead of null, we have 0. Also, note that the name of this column is based on this function call. You want to rename this to something meaningful like risk factor. That is better. So this is how we create and use our functions. Also, similar to views and stored procedures, it's a good practice to save your functions in SQL files and put them under source control. I already covered that before, so I'm not going to repeat it. And finally, we can use the drop function statement to drop a function. So we type drop function. Optionally and preferably, we can type if exists, and then we type the name of the function, get risk factor for client.